Our learning target for today is for you to be able to describe the events of September 11th. I was 17 years old on the morning of 9/11, 2001. I was a freshman in college sitting in my very first class of the day. It was Honors World History. And I remember we had barely gotten into our lesson before another professor came in the room. He seemed really agitated, and he told my professor there was an accident in New York City on the TVs, and we were trying to process what was going on, looking at the news footage of what was happening in New York. And shortly after, the second plane hit the towers. And I remember that moment. It was like just a pause in the room where we all processed and understood that it seemed like our country was under attack. And classes were canceled for the day, and we were told to go stay in our dorm rooms and not to leave. And we huddled around TV screens in each other's rooms, trying to figure out what was going on, glued to the screen. We were calling family and friends, and we were being told not to panic, to stay calm. But there didn't seem to be anything to be calm about. On the morning of September 11th, our whole world changed. Terrorists hijacked 4 airplanes. 2 planes crashed into 2 of the world's tallest buildings at the World Trade Center in New York City. At 8:45 a.m., an American Airlines Boeing 767, loaded with 20,000 gallons of jet fuel, crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. 18 minutes later, at 9:03 a.m., a second 767 crashed into the South Tower. A third plane crashed into the Pentagon building in Washington, D.C. The Pentagon is the headquarters for the United States Department of Defense. Passengers on the 4th plane fought with the terrorists, and it crashed into a field in Pennsylvania. This plane was possibly headed for the White House, but because of the bravery and the sacrifice of those passengers, it never reached its target. The most lives were unfortunately lost in the World Trade Center attacks. When the planes crashed into the towers, they exploded and caused a fire that trapped the people inside the buildings. The planes leaked vast amounts of fuel, causing the structures to weaken and to fall. The first tower collapsed 56 minutes after impact, and the second fell after an hour and 42 minutes. New York City skyline used to be defined by the Twin Towers. It was this iconic image over Manhattan, and it was one of the first things you thought about when you thought about New York City. After the events of 9/11, it would never look the same. The 9/11 attacks were also the deadliest incident ever for firefighters as well as for law enforcement officers in the United States. The New York City Fire Department lost 343 firefighters. The New York City Police Department lost 23 officers, and the Port Authority lost 37 officers. These men and women died trying to save the lives of those trapped in the towers. They were not prepared for how quickly the towers would collapse. At 9:59 a.m., the South Tower suddenly disintegrated, and it collapsed within 10 seconds. In the days following 9/11, New York City and the rest of the world came together to grieve and to mourn and show support for our country. This attack caused a huge loss, but it did not defeat the spirit of the U.S. The terrorist goal was to incite fear and panic and destroy the heart of America. They didn't succeed. We would respond by officially declaring a war on terror. Although 9/11 is a heartbreaking story, it is a day full of loss, it also showed our capacity to come together in times of trouble. It was a story of unity, of selflessness and heroism, and it shows what we can do as a nation when we put our differences aside and when we are called to act. Tomorrow, we are going to discuss more on the war on terror and how the U.S. responded and how we came out of this as a nation with better security laws. But that is the end of today's lesson. I want you to remember that we learn about 9/11 so we never forget the sacrifice of those brave men and women who responded on that day and the men and women who lost their lives because of those terror attacks. Now I want you to get your workbook and turn to page 140 so that we can complete your check for understanding. Page 140, Chapter 25. The United States fights terrorism. Terrorists strike America. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, our world changed. Terrorists hijacked 4 airplanes. They flew two of them into two of the world's tallest buildings at the World Trade Center in New York City. Another plane smashed into the Pentagon building in our nation's capital, Washington, D.C. Passengers on the fourth plane fought with the terrorists, and it crashed into a field in Pennsylvania. Almost 3,000 people died that day. It was a very sad day in America. President George Bush decided that America would fight back. He committed to a war on terrorism in response to the events of September 11. Besides finding the people responsible for attacking America, he wanted to prevent terrorist activities all over the world. The war on terrorism would be a different kind. It is still going on today. America's response to terrorism. After the attacks on September 11, 2001, the United States reacted by increasing America's security, searching for terrorists, destroying camps where terrorists are trained, forming alliances with other countries to fight terrorism, dealing with countries that let terrorists live there, finding out who gives terrorists money, and putting America's military into position for military action. Let's look at the inference activity at the top of page 141. Check the most wanted you believe the United States is looking for in the war on terrorism. Those who run a training camp for terrorists. So we would definitely be interested in any country that was running training camp for terrorists because that would be against our security interests. Next, a country with a different terrorism policy. Just because the country has a different terrorism policy than the United States doesn't mean that they are security risks for us. A country that lets terrorists live there. So we would definitely want to put a check there. Any country that allows terrorists to live there is supporting terrorism. A country that is struck by terrorists. So one of the things that we just read on the previous page said that we want to form alliance with countries who were fighting terrorism, so we wouldn't check that one. Those who finance terrorist groups. So finance means to give money to provide for. So we would definitely be interested in any individuals who were giving money and resources to terrorists who were security risks for America. And the final check is for victims of terrorism. So we're not going to check that box because victims of terrorism would not be a security risk for the United States of America. And that is it for today. Tomorrow we will complete this page and do the discuss it activity. I'll see you or talk to you tomorrow.